Thank you for watching the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, and don't forget to subscribe. If you can support the museum, please think of backing us on Patreon or joining one of our membership schemes. Or if you watch to the end of this video, you'll be able to see how you can help the museum by buying items from our online shop. This tank chat's going to be about the Stridsvagn 103, a Swedish tank from the Cold War era, known to many of us in the English-speaking world as the S-tank. And it's an interesting story. The S-tank gets talked about a lot because it's one of these vehicles that shows a real different path than the traditional turreted tank. Now, we haven't done a tank chat on any other Swedish tank so far, so Sweden just basically, it's tried to follow a path of neutrality. After the First World War, it imports some LK2 tanks, the tanks that Germany was building or just starting to try and build towards the end of 1918. These vehicles are taken across and assembled in Sweden. They experiment with the LK2 tanks, they improve on those or some of them during their service life, and they also get a license to build the TNH tanks from Czechoslovakia as well in the 1930s. Now, Sweden does not fight in World War II, but it has a massive citizen army. It's in that really awkward position because it's got Norway on one side, there's of course in 1940s invaded by the Germans. It's got Finland, who are fighting initially against the Russians on their own, later against the Russians with Nazi support on the other side. And it's, again, as a trading partner, it's traditionally traded with the Baltic states, including Germany. So throughout the Second World War, it's under a lot of pressure because the Germans are trying to continue to get the iron ore, the ball bearings, other raw materials as well from Sweden, whereas obviously the Western Allies are trying to say to Sweden, whoa, you know, you should stop supporting this Nazi regime and try and be more helpful to us. Now, after World War II, what happens is, in that Cold War era, Sweden looks at the world situation, and obviously its biggest threat, as it sees at the time, is likely to come from the Soviet bloc, the Warsaw Pact countries. And you only have to look at maps of the region, you realise actually how close Sweden is to not just the Baltic states, but actually also parts of the Russian Federation as they are now, but Russia at the time, or the USSR as it was then. Now, Sweden looks to improve its armoured forces. So it's trying to sort of say, what can we put into service? And the ideal tank for the Swedes at the time is going to be the Centurion. The problem is, in the early 1950s, Britain needs its own Centurions, not just to build up its own tank fleet, but it's also got the Korean War when that kicks off as well. So because of this, Sweden then looks at the AMX-13, the French tank, as an alternative, and it starts doing a major assessment of the AMX-13. Now later what happens is Britain changes its mind and decides to sell the Centurion to the Swedes, and they're doing that for a number of reasons, one of which, the real basic one, is they are desperately short of hard currency. Britain has just gone through World War II, it's almost a bankrupt nation. Selling tanks to countries like Sweden is a way of actually getting money back into the coffers. So when Britain decides to sell the Centurion, the Swedes drop the AMX-13 as a potential tank. They look at the Centurion, they take it into service, and one of the earliest Centurions that actually is given or sold to Sweden from Britain, it goes through a number of upgrades in Swedish service, it actually was given back in the early 2000s to Britain, and it's now here at the Tank Museum, showing that line of service given by the head of the Swedish Army. Now, as soon as the Centurion is going into Swedish service, they start a program to think about what's going to replace it. Tank production, even procurement takes quite some time, and in this particular area, if you think of the 1950s, there's a lot going on in terms of East versus West, the Cold War, and also in just the whole tank business. So Sweden is looking at what can we do, and the Royal Swedish Army Materials Administration puts out a requirement in the mid-1950s saying, listen, what could be the proposals that we can look at? And they end up looking at 3 different options, one of which, Proposal A, is the idea of perhaps an Anglo-American tank, 40 tons plus sort of weight, bigger, heavier, well-armoured. They look at Proposal T, which is going back to a lighter French, more mobile tank as a possibility, or they look at their own indigenous option S, which is for a Swedish vehicle. Let's look at ideas that we might be able to put together in-house. And with that third option, we have to then talk about this design genius, some would call him, behind the S-tank, Sven Berger. Now, Berger had been trained in Sweden, he's Swedish, he trains as an engineer in the 30s, he does his military service in the Swedish army during the World War II period, but he's also heavily involved in armoured vehicles. So it's Sven Berger who puts a suggestion forward that they can upgrade their M42 tanks by putting on more powerful guns, these ex-flak 7.5 flak guns as they were previously were, put them on tanks to give that tanks a longer lease of life. He's also one of the team that's doing the inspection of the AMX-13 as a potential tank to take into service for the Swedes after the Second World War period. Now, Sven Berger, one of the things he really looks at is what has knocked out or destroyed tanks in the Second World War, and for the time he's doing this as well, the most recent conflict where tanks are used that gathers a lot of interest, Korea. And what he discovers there is, statistically, half of the tanks that are knocked out because of hits on the turret. And he takes that information along with evidence from the Second World War, such as the effectiveness of German Sturmgeschützes, a low-profile vehicle with a gun mounted in the hull, and he puts this together to come up with a fairly radical new proposal, which we now know of as the S-tank. Now, that proposal, what he's really trying to do is, with the evidence he's got about this 50% of vehicles being knocked out by turret hits, he's also looking at the fact that on an average main battle tank, the turret weight is about 25% of the vehicle. So if you say goodbye to a turret, you're doing a weight saving, and also you're creating less of a potential target. So this leads him to come up with the idea, which is you actually have the gun solidly mounted on the hull of the vehicle, and you add a very clever suspension system to help, and steering to help aim that gun. And it's probably one of the best ways of trying to describe what that concept is think of the S-tank as being a proposal where really it's like the turret on the tracks directly, so that you're aiming the whole of that gun in a solid mounting by manoeuvring the tracks up and down or left and right to actually do the aiming. Now, this is Sven Berger's proposal, but he comes up as part of this as a number of other original ideas as well. For example, let's place 2 engines in this vehicle, one of which is going to be a gas turbine, and this will be the first tank that goes into production that has a gas turbine engine, well ahead of the American Abrams, the M1, or later the Russian T-80. Other countries, Britain has already had a look at putting a gas turbine in a tank, but this is the first one that actually goes into production. And his idea there is he gets a Boeing 502, the gas turbine engine. It's got about 300 horsepower, you're looking there, and he's going to marry it up with a Rolls-Royce K60 engine, and the 2 engines are basically the only things that come from outside Sweden to go in this vehicle. And the idea being you can use your normal K60 engine for driving around most of the time. If you need extra power, extra speed, that's when you'll bring in the ability of this gas turbine engine to give you more oomph. Later on, the Boeing, after the first 70 of actually the S-tanks were made, that engine is replaced with an even more powerful Caterpillar gas turbine engine that has about 490 horsepower that can bring to the vehicle. So 2 new engine types. Reasoning there, power of the gas turbine, but also if one engine fails, there is a redundancy. This vehicle can maneuver under each of those engines separately, as it were. It doesn't have to have both in combination. So you've got a built-in redundancy there for the vehicle. The other clever ideas that Sven Berger's thinking about. So he's got the idea of the gun, and the gun they go for is a 105mm L74 gun that's made by Bofors. So it's about a metre longer than the Royal Ordnance L7 105mm gun, but it can fire that ammunition types because by this time the 105 gun, the Royal Ordnance gun, is getting into service in quite a number of countries, and their own, of course, their own Centurions are going to be upgunned with that 105. So this commonality of ammunition is quite an important thing. Now the gun, because it is actually in a fixed mounting on the chassis of the vehicle, that means, of course, the breech doesn't maneuver at all. And that then gives Sven Berger the opportunity to add an autoloader without the problems of having a gun that's maneuvering all the time in the space, because the space stays the same, because the whole of that chassis is aiming the gun. Now, the autoloader they decide to put in there, it's got basically a system with 25 rounds in, about another 25 rounds can be carried by the vehicle for reloading. And once that gun, this very long gun, like I say, it's about a metre longer than the 105 on a Centurion, once that gun's fired, the cartridge case is ejected automatically through a portal at the rear of the tank, so it's shot out the back straight away, so it doesn't take up any room. Now again, as part of this design process, Berger looks at the fact, well, hang on a second, that means we don't need a loader anymore because we've got an auto-loader system. And he's also looking at the fact that the driver, because he's going to have to aim the gun, he can be the gunner too, so we can dispense with the gunner. And he gets down to the point of suggesting initially that the S-Tank should have 2 crew members, the driver and the gunner in the front as a single role, and the commander radio operator as a single role in the turret. Now, when this was looked at, it's one of those topics that different countries have different attitudes to tank crew numbers. Certainly in Britain, with their experience from tank warfare in World War II, adamant you need at least 4 people to do the tasks of maintaining a tank and keeping it resupplied and doing everything you need to with that particular vehicle. Otherwise, there's too much stress, too much pressure on a crew that's less than 4. But Berger, he looks at this, he sees there's solutions to some of the problems of only having 2 people in the vehicle. For example, ammunition replenishment. When you're actually having to put more 105mm ammunition into this tank, you could always add extra people on the ammunition resupply vehicles to bolster the number that's available for resupplying the vehicle. But there's still too many other tasks that 2 people in the vehicle, let alone combat, they're going to get overloaded in doing this. So in the end, he comes back to the idea, let's put 3 people in the vehicle, but the 3rd person, he gives them the role of the radio operator, but he also gives them a driving role, but the position is behind the actual driver in this vehicle facing rearwards. And he has controls and a sighting system that he can look backwards, and he's driving literally facing out the back of the vehicle. So the commander is not only the commander, but he's also given the option of being able to control and drive the tank, to also be able to aim the gun on the tank, and he's got the same firing controls as the gunner in the front. So they can double up in their roles as part of this 3-man crew. So 3 people protected by a level of armour that doesn't sound much. It's 40 to 70 millimetres of armour is placed on the vehicle, but because of the shape of the vehicle, this wedge shape they do, especially with all the mechanics, the engines at the front, the gearboxes, etc., that ends up creating a large area, a large mass before the crew who are at the back of the vehicle, so they're better protected. And in line of sight, because of that low angle, you're looking at well over 300 millimetres of armour protection that an incoming round has got to penetrate if it gets all the way through to the crew at the back there. So it's a fairly well protected vehicle. one of the other most obvious things that you'll see on the front of the S-tanks, you've got machine guns, KSP 58s in this little box on one side, tools, etc. on the other. You've also got this bar armour. Now that was kept secret till about 1993. It's got about, I think it's about 32, 33 of these bars on the front, and again, that was kept secret. Simple way of doing bar armour against heat rounds incoming. So there was things like that that were kept back, only to be used should it look like this vehicle was going to go out there and actually do some fighting, which, as I said earlier, fortunately for all concerned, that never actually happened with the S-tank and Sweden. So we've looked at the engine, we've looked at the gun, we've looked a little bit about the mobility. He ends up making, it's only got 4 road wheels, he makes the track length quite short. That's for ease of steering. It's very maneuverable that way. By shortening the track length, that's one of the ways that you can actually steer it that much more effective. And the ideas are accepted by the Swedish authorities. And on February the 4th, 1958, they declare that that's the route they want to go. The option they want to take up is the indigenous, the S-tank proposal by Sven Berger. And when they announce this, again, part of the reasoning they announce is they say, look, Sweden, we're an independent country, we are a neutral country, or they try to be neutral most of the time. What they're actually doing there is they're saying, by this choice, we're making our own tanks, so we don't show favoritism to other sides, and we're also being able to show and help build an indigenous engineering, production and design capabilities within the countries. Now they build initially, in 58, they ordered 2 prototype vehicles. Before they've even finished, in 1960, they ordered 10 pre-production vehicles to do all the testing on. And obviously, as you can imagine, there's a lot of interest around the world in this radical new design that has been put forward. The actual production vehicles start in 1967, that goes through to 1971, 290 are completed, and in Swedish service they go through model. The first model is really the basic thing that comes out. As always, lots of changes within the production run. Model B, they come up with, they decide to change the Rolls-Royce B60 engine. It ends up becoming a Detroit diesel engine that's replaced there. And also, by the way, all the tanks are retrofitted to bring them up to the Model B standard. So the way that they, quite often in this way, is the changes are run throughout the whole 290 of the fleet. Now, again, other changes that happen to the vehicle. So they've ended up increasing the engine power, but they also changed the suspension. So this gun barrel, initially it can depress 11 degrees, and they changed that to 16 degrees by changing the suspension system, improving on it for later models. And part of this issue is because if you're looking at this vehicle in a hull down position, one of the things for a defensive rolled vehicle, as this initially was being thought through as, one of the things is on the blind side of a hill, you're going to need to be able to depress the barrel as well as elevate it for taking on targets that will be coming your way. Now, interestingly, part of the theory that was explained to a lot of people, and one of the first theories I picked up on about the S-tank, is the idea of, if you look at the Swedish terrain, you've got lots of lakes. So again, on the B model, they add a flotation screen, so this can actually be swum across rivers just by the tracks going. But also lots of forests in Sweden. And this idea of, with the B model again, initially one S-tank in every platoon had a dozer blade on the front. It's actually fitted under here. It can be deployed downwards to help dig out a scrape for hiding the vehicle. With the B model, every tank gets fitted with one of these dozer blades. And this idea of using the landscape, dig a scrape, there's a road or a ride through a forest. This vehicle can be in a hull down position, take on any attacking armour, perhaps block the road, and with that reverse driver immediately manoeuvre to another position. Interestingly, if you look at the Swedish doctrine, that was what I'd picked up on a lot. Actually, the Swedish doctrine was much more about aggressive use of armour should there have been an invasion, a beachhead established by an invading force. Again, the assumption being the Soviet Union. So this idea that actually these tanks were going to have to be used on the attack. Now, as they're going into production, there are elements of this design which are picked up on very early on, as even in the discussion phrases, that show there's issues with going with this design. So the fact is, with this gun mounted solidly in the hull the way it is, it cannot fire on the move, because basically the whole of this vehicle, when it's actually maneuvering, in other words driving, it won't be able to. That gun will be randomly going wherever the vehicle's pointing at that time, so it cannot fire on the move. And Sven Berger's argument about this at the time was, don't worry about that, because even with the stabilised gun on our new Centurions, the truth is most of the time the tanks have to stop to fire most accurately. So he did not see this as a major problem, even though it was much commented on at the time. Another issue, though, that he says is because at that time they don't see the future of stabilisation going much further. And in essence, in this, he's wrong. Because what happens is a Chieftain comes along with a fully stabilised gun not that many years later, so by the end of the 1960s, you've got that ability of a main battle tank to fire very accurately on the move. So in that area, you could question, is this a good idea, that they've got to be able to stop to be able to fire from that point of view all the time. The interest, Finland looks at the vehicle, Norway looks at the vehicle, two are sent here to Bovington for evaluation at the end of the 1960s. In our archive and library here, we have got lots of the reports on this, and in 1973, 10 S-tanks are actually borrowed from the Swedish military, sent out to BARR, the British Army of the Rhine, and they test, Royal Tank Regiment test over about 6 weeks, these vehicles in what they would consider operational conditions. And again, there's lengthy reports that come back from this. Mixed reviews. Some countries look at the problem, short wheelbase, bogging in, I say short wheelbase, short track base on the ground, the fact it can't climb much more, where most standard tanks can climb a vertical face a lot better than the S-tank can. There's pros and cons there. Interesting, they didn't see its ability to manoeuvre and turn the gun on the target as its worst feature. That again, in the North German plane, open spaces, the idea of many targets, that you would have thought would have come straight forward. But again, in some of those reports, one of the things I found particularly interesting is one of the things I think a lot of people find confusing. Hang on, how come we call this the S-tank, where many other people might have called it a self-propelled gun or an assault gun, like along the lines of a Sturmgeschütz before? And this is one of the things picked up by one of the British officers writing on the report. He basically says at the beginning, he says, if anyone else tells me this is a tank, their report's going straight out my window, because he's saying just because someone says it's a tank doesn't mean to say, self-identification or whatever you want to call it, just because someone says it's that doesn't mean to say it is that. But the argument about why the Swedes in particular are saying this is a tank is because of how they intended to tactically use it. In other words, they were trying to use it for all the roles a normal turreted tank would have. And on the whole, in the West, certainly, the assumption being that a tank is something with a turret with a 360 direct fire weapon on. What they're really saying here is, as I said earlier, is really an S-tank is doing just that. It just has tracks on the turret instead of having a separate turret there, because tactically they intend to use it the same. And again, lots of criticisms and arguments going around that still about did it really actually change the price of fish at all. Now, that idea of looking back, so they go through their Model A, Model B, Model C, issues, their improvements and all those models. They even come up with a Model D in the mid-1990s that's going to have reactive armor, lasers, guidance systems, all sorts of other computers added. But that program, they come up with a vehicle to demonstrate, but that program is dropped at the end of the 90s, and in 1997 this comes out of service, the S-tank, and it's replaced by Leopard 2 in service. So trying to judge the effectiveness of the S-tank is quite hard, because of course it never actually gets to fire its gun in anger. It is, some would argue, therefore very successful because it did its job, it was there, it stopped any aggressor potentially invading. Other people would say complete waste of money therefore because it never did get to fire its gun in anger. But one of the things that come out of it is, did it really lead to other people copying the idea? Because in that post-war era, in Britain, for example, we had contentious, similar idea was put forward to making a lighter weight vehicle with a gun, again being aimed by manoeuvring the tracks, etc. But actually, no one else takes this up, and it doesn't really have a successor or any follow-up. So whether everyone therefore thinks this lovely idea but didn't really lead anywhere, evidently no one else takes up on this as one of the ideas. One of the other criticisms that's sometimes levelled is this business about all that energy, all that effort that was one of the original intentions, which is to make a low profile vehicle. Suspension system here, it can lower it down 13 centimetres by making it even lower. But the truth is that the actual standard height of an S-tank is only 6 centimetres lower than its potential adversary at the time, a T-62 tank. So here again, we've got features and ideas that sound very impressive, but do they actually make much of a difference when you're lining it up against the opposition it might have fought against, or even the Allied tanks it was alongside? Did it really change things in many ways? And that one there is open for question. But again, one of these tanks that's talked about an awful lot because of this, the nature of its design, the fact it was actually put into production rather than just experimentally, as so many countries were doing, trying to come up with radical new ideas for that tank function in the post-war world. This one actually got into service and saw some service. Now out of service, no one else bought it. But there's a number of these amazing vehicles in museums, and we're very pleased to have this one here at Bovington. We have a fantastic selection of books, models, clothes and other gifts on the Tank Museum online shop. When you buy from our online shop, you are supporting the Tank Museum charity, and that means we can carry on caring for our collection and producing this content. If you have supported us already, thank you very much, subscribe and do keep watching.